This is the place where a lot of people make a mistake. And it's that you should not share confidential information with anyone unless and until they have signed a confidentiality agreement. So that means anyone, anywhere, anytime who's going to have access to your confidential proprietary information, they've got to sign a confidentiality agreement.
Get ready to build, protect, and sell your expertise online with the Online Genius Podcast. You'll laugh. We hope you won't cry. But you'll always be informed and prepared so you can have the success you want. Here's your host, Bobby Klinck.
Hey there. Welcome to this week's episode of the Online Genius Podcast. I'm your host, Bobby Klinck, and I am excited for today's show because we're continuing our series of legal mini trainings. And today we're going to be talking about an area of law, a legal concept that doesn't get the respect it deserves, but that you as an online entrepreneur definitely need to know about, need to respect, and need to use to your advantage. Today, we're talking about trade secret law. And trade secret law, that's just really a fancy word for, the area of law that protects your confidential information. So we're going to dive into that today. We're going to talk about what is trade secret law, kind of what's the standard, how do you get it, what do you need to do to keep it, and then talk about the places where it comes up in your business and what you need to be doing in those contexts to make sure you get the protection you need. So again, it's going to be an action-packed episode, probably a little bit shorter because this is kind of an area of law that you really can grasp pretty quickly, and we're going to go through it. I'm not going to belabor the point. I'm just going to get you the information you need so you can apply this in your business. So let's dive in. The first issue is, what is a trade secret? What does trade secret law mean, etc.? Now, I want to back up and say that this is an area of intellectual property law about an intangible asset that's a bit different from some of the other areas. So it's different than copyright and trademark because there are issues of state law that apply as well. There's a federal law that comes into play, but ultimately this is an area of law that started with the states, that the various states had these different rules that applied, and the standard luckily kind of converged. So even though there were a bunch of different states and the law developed in different places, at the end of the day, trade secret law protects commercial information that is confidential or not generally known, that has value because it's confidential or not generally known. And here's the key, that you take reasonable steps to keep confidential. So there's a couple of things there. I want to dissect it. Now, part of this is that your trade secret issue or trade secret law is only going to protect information that's not generally known. So it's not about stuff that maybe you like, but that is nothing new. There's nothing special about it. That's not going to be protected because it's generally known. But the more important thing is, and where a fight will come up about trade secret law is, did you take reasonable steps to protect it? And so the good thing is, the good news about this is that you're going to automatically be doing this, or you should be automatically doing this, because of course you want to protect it. And so taking reasonable steps is just good business practice as well as everything else. So that's kind of in a nutshell what it is, but let's talk about that a bit, more deeply. What are the kinds of things that fall under trade secret law? Well, the most common examples probably don't apply to you. The things that you would hear about if you kind of looked out and did some searching for trade secret law, because normally it would be things like recipes or, something like that. So a couple of examples of that. The Coca-Cola recipe is a trade secret that has been protected for over a century. And what it is, to give you a sense of how closely guarded it is, the only paper copies of it are kept in a bank vault in Atlanta, Georgia, where Coca-Cola is based. And there are less than 5 people who actually know the entire recipe. And another example that's kind of similar is the Kentucky Fried Chicken spice recipe. Now, I don't know if you're a huge fan of Kentucky Fried Chicken or not, but they pride themselves on their secret spice mix, which is a trade secret that they have protected for a long time as well. So they take all these steps to protect it. Now, let's talk about how it might apply to your business. What are some areas where in your business, you have confidential information or information that's not generally known that has value. There's a couple of obvious places that almost everyone's going to have. It's your leads list, your customer list, your CRM database. All of that stuff has value. And especially your CRM database where you're tracking all this information about, interests, etc. But let's talk about some other areas where you might have it. Let's say you're in a business where part of what you do is match people on two sides of things. Well, your database of people on each side is something that you would want to protect because it's, you have value in having put that together. So an example of this that I like to use is there are various services out there that match podcast guests with podcast hosts, and they will have proprietary databases of both sides. So that's obviously valuable information. Now, it could also be if you have a kind of behind the scenes proprietary method of doing what you do that has value and that gets better results, and that if everyone started using it, you wouldn't get these same results. And again, this isn't going to be a perfect example because I'm almost sure it's not true, but I like to use it to give you an idea of the kind of thing I'm talking about. If you were a Facebook ad management company or Facebook ad manager, and you had developed a particular way of going through and picking audiences, testing them, refining them, optimizing them, etc., and as a result of that method, you were getting better results than other people, well, that is the kind of thing that you might be able to protect, that method. If, again, it is in fact not generally known, it is proprietary, you can keep it secret, etc. So that's the kind of example I like to give to get your juices flowing on maybe what might be protected. But essentially, it's anything in your business that's confidential and you have value from it. So that's kind of what's protected. Let's talk about what trade secret law is really about, okay? And how is it that, what's it about protecting? What's it about preventing? I like to say that trade secret law is really about internal threats. It's not really about someone from the outside coming and copying your stuff or stealing your stuff. There's a little bit of that. But really what trade secret law is about protecting you from internal threats. So people who rightly have access to the information from then using it to somehow hurt you or compete with you in the future. So the way I like to analogize this is you don't need trade secret law to stop someone from breaking into your office or breaking into your computer and stealing your confidential information. That's already a crime, right? That's already protected. What this is about is protecting you when you share this information. Maybe it's with people who work for you. Maybe it's with people that you're considering doing business with. Or maybe it's from customers or clients. So you get kind of the sense that this is about the internal theft. Now, what I also want to make clear is that trade secret law will largely say that it is not only kind of a civil thing where you can go after people, but a crime for someone to take your trade secrets without permission and against your will. It rarely comes up that way, but it is in fact a crime. So what trade secret law does is allow you to share information that is otherwise confidential with people in a certain way and then protect it and not allow it to then kind of get out into the general public and lose its confidential nature. So that's what trade secret law is. Now, how do you get it and how do you protect it? This is really the nuts and bolts of what you need to do. And this comes down to kind of that last element of trade secret law when I set out what it is. That is that you have to take reasonable efforts to keep it confidential. And the good thing is, this is a sliding scale. So it's not something where you have to take the same level of protection no matter what. Again, I mentioned the Coca-Cola recipe is stored in a bank vault and only 5 people have access to it. Now, you don't have to take that kind of, efforts to protect the thing because your trade secrets probably aren't that valuable, and that would be a bit unreasonable to expect you to do that with all of your things. What you have to do is take reasonable steps. And what that means, I can't give you an exact every time do X, Y, and Z, but I can give you kind of a 4-part element to it. So the first piece is you need to limit access to the information to the people who need to know it. And so again, this goes back to the notion that I did mention about the Coca-Cola recipe, where only 5 people know the whole recipe. And again, it may not have to be that small for your case, but the point is that you're not going to just be sharing this with all kinds of people who don't need to know it. Even if you kind of meet the other elements, you need to say, hey, does this person need to actually know this information? Yes or no? And the example I like to give is, let's say you had a VA, and that VA's job was simply to book travel for you. Let's just say that you had someone that was their only role. Now, they might need access to certain information, like, for example, your credit card data and your frequent flyer mile numbers, et cetera, so they can do that piece. But they don't need access to your CRM database. If you have a proprietary way of doing business, they don't need access to that. And so you need to say, hey, I'm going to kind of put you in silos. Here's the information you need, and you'll get access to that. But you don't need access to this other information, so I'm not going to give it to you there. So that's the first piece, is limit access to the people who need to know. Now, then the next 2 pieces are related. One is physical security, and the other is electronic security. Let's talk about physical security first. This, for most online entrepreneurs, isn't really a big deal, right? Because most of us are working in a home office, and so we don't have a lot of people coming through our office, etc. But the notion of physical security is pretty simple. Lock it up when you're not using it. In other words, make it so that someone can't stumble into the physical copy of your confidential information, wherever that might be. Now, again, it depends on how confidential it is, but some obvious steps, like if you have a guest coming to your house or to your office, you need to make sure that you don't have your confidential information out. And it needs to be in some way so they won't have access to it. We can think of all kinds of examples of this in movies where people have, gotten a hot lead because they were in someone's office and they saw something on their desk. I think one example, it was called The Paper. It was I don't remember who the stars were in it, but someone was interviewing for a job at a different newspaper and saw something on this editor's desk and then took that and used it to build a story, right? So that's an example where if you leave it out and have someone in your office, you can't complain if they use it. You're just not going to be able to. So you have to just put it away when someone's going to be there and lock it up when it's not in use. Now, what does lock it up mean? Well, if you have your home office, it's not a big deal, right? Because your office is going to be locked. So not your office, maybe your house, it's going to be locked. So you don't have to worry about that. But, if it's more confidential and something that's more valuable, hey, put it in a locked filing cabinet in your office. And just make sure that people aren't going to have access to it when they're rightly, in somewhere. If they're in a physical space and they have a right to be there, but they shouldn't know this information, make sure they're not going to be able to see it or get access to it. So that's the key to the physical security. That takes us to the second piece of this, or this is the third element overall, which is electronic security. What this means is a couple of things. One, this relates to limiting access, right? So you don't just have a single shared folder that everybody has access to on your team, for example. You set it up and say, okay, well, I've got, this information over here, and only the people with, who need access will have access to that particular area, whether it's, within Dropbox or Google Drive or somewhere else. But you're going to put those kinds of silos in place. But it's also about password protecting things. So again, it always blows my mind that I will see people who have their phone not protected by a password. Now, forget business. It seems like a crazy thing to do personally because your phone has all kinds of personal information about you. But from a business perspective, your smartphone probably has just about all of your confidential information on it. Heck, my phone, I've got Dropbox. I can access all of my files on it. I've got my email. I've got, my social media. I've got all of these other different apps. And so if someone gets on my phone, they can get access to all kinds of confidential information. So you need to have a password on it. And again, you need to take reasonable steps. I don't want you to put some password you're never going to protect because, again, if someone is going to try to hack your phone, they're going to try to hack your phone, and it's going to happen. And again, hopefully we never get there and you never have that problem, but it's just about taking some reasonable steps here. Put a password on it. Make sure that it's password protected. But you should do the same thing with your computer, and you should do the same thing with databases. You should do the same thing with any of these other programs. And so you need to use those kinds of common sense steps with your electronic world. So again, that kind of two pieces. One, use passwords to protect everything. And number two, put things in silos so you can actually limit access to people who need to know. So then that brings us to the last step. The last piece of protecting your trade secrets and protecting your confidential information. And this is the place where a lot of people make a mistake. And it's that you should not share confidential information with anyone, even if you've done everything else and met every other step, unless and until they have signed a confidentiality agreement. So that means anyone, anywhere, anytime who's going to have access to your confidential proprietary information, they've got to sign a confidentiality agreement. And so what is a confidentiality agreement say in this place? Number one, it defines the confidential information very broadly. I mean, my template document has a catch-all list that probably has 50 different things. I don't know, but it also says, and anything else that a reasonable person would think is confidential. So it's a very broad definition of confidential information. And then what it says is, depending on what the nature of the relationship is, it basically says kind of this in all those circumstances. You will only use the confidential information you learn from me for my business purpose or our joint business purpose. That's it. And once that is done, you will not use this for anything. You will destroy any copies or you will give it back to me. So in other words, you're basically saying the only thing you can do with this information is to advance my business interest. And that's what a confidentiality agreement does in this role. And that's kind of where it comes into play. So the purpose of these is to put a contractual obligation on these people so there's no doubt. Now, again, I will tell you that there will be some cases, there will be some instances where you may be able to argue that, they were under an implied duty of confidentiality, et cetera, but you just don't want to get into that place. You don't want to find yourself in a situation where you're having to argue about whether or not these people had an obligation to keep it confidential. Now, there are a couple of clear examples where you don't have to worry about it, right? You don't have to have a lawyer who you hire sign a confidentiality obligation. The reason why? Well, I, as a lawyer, am ethically obligated to keep any information I learn from my clients confidential. Now, this is clients, not, if you just kind of start talking to me on the internet or something like that. But if you hire me as your lawyer, you don't have to worry about having a confidentiality agreement with me because I'm obligated to keep it confidential. But anyone else outside of maybe doctors and lawyers and any place like that, you just need to use these every time in every instance. Now, often these will not be standalone agreements. They'll be part of a bigger agreement you have with people, but you need to make sure that the confidentiality element is included. So that's kind of the four things you need to do. So let's go over those again. The four things you need to do to make sure that you actually get protection and keep it. Number one, limit access to the information to people who actually need to know it. Number two, you use some basic physical security, which basically means lock it up and don't have it where someone can see it. The third step is use electronic security. And so that's basically password protect and limit access. And then the final piece is use confidentiality agreements before you share this information. Those are the key steps you need to take. Now, while we're talking about this, I want to give you a quick explanation of an issue that we're going to kind of talk about in a second when we talk about what are the uses. A confidentiality agreement is similar to what you may have heard of as a non-compete. And a non-compete is an agreement that says, hey, because I'm hiring you or because you're a contractor or because you're this, you can't compete with me in this same line of business. There are problems with those contracts, though. Depending on the state where you are, for example, they may just be, hey, you just can't use those. They're not going to be enforced no matter what. California is a pretty good example of that. California courts have largely simply said, we will not enforce these agreements because people should be free to do, to ply their trade, if you will. So, and that kind of makes sense. But if you can't use those, what you can do, though, is you can say that although you could compete with me, you can't use the confidential information you use while working for me, with me, etc., to then compete with me. So in a sense, your confidentiality agreements are limiting people from competing with you using your information. That's what you need to understand and where the role is. So with that background, now I want to talk about, in a sense, kind of the three places where these issues tend to come up for online entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs more generally. The first place is with workers. So this is with independent contractors and employees both. If you think about it, your contractors and your employees are going to have access to your confidential information. Now, you may have some employees who don't need it. You may have some contractors who don't need it. But, you're going to have some contractors and some employees who will need access to this information. It's just that simple. And so as a result, we're going to consider these folks together. And this is why I said this is the context where it really is very much like a non-compete, right? We are using these confidentiality agreements and trade secrets to prevent these folks from being able to compete with us using our own information. And I'm going to give you an example of this. Well, before I give you an example, let me just go ahead and say this. The point is that you need to have a confidentiality agreement or a confidentiality clause in a broader agreement that you have with every independent contractor, every employee, anyone who works in or for your business. It's just that simple. I have an independent contractor agreement template, which includes this clause. For employees, my template's usually it's kind of a standalone agreement because you have a few different agreements you're going to have employees sign. So you have to get that in place. Now, I want to give you an example to help you understand the power of this. So when I first started trying to market myself to online entrepreneurs, I decided one of the ways to do it was to go appear on podcasts. And, this came from a business coach I was talking to who said, hey, I could really see you actually talking to people and giving some lessons, etc. And so I said, hey, that's a great idea. And so I started doing this, but I didn't have the time, the wherewithal, or really even the skill set to try to reach out to podcast hosts myself. Now, I could have figured it out, but there are these companies out there where their job is you hire them and they are then to market you and match you with podcast hosts. And so I went with this company. And at the time that I hired them, they were using independent contractors to do the actual matching. So the person I dealt with at the company, who I interacted with on a daily basis, who was pitching me to podcasts, who was telling me, when I got accepted, etc., was an independent contractor. Now, within a couple of months of me working with them, the business owner decided she wanted to actually bring all of this in-house, stop using contractors, have employees in one centralized location. I don't know why she made that decision, but she did. And so at that point, the contractor who I've been working with, who's been my primary point person for this company, has to go off and do her own thing. And she actually formed her own company doing this same thing. I mean, she built up a skill set. She was quite good at it. Now, if you think about it, if this contractor had come to me and said, hey, Bobby, look, I know the kind of shows you want to be on. I know it's been successful. I know who we've pitched you to. I know, all of these things. And oh, by the way, I know how much, this company's charging you. And let's say that this woman had also taken the database of podcast hosts with the contact information, what they're looking for, how they want to be matched, and taken a copy with her. She could have come to me and pitched and said, hey, I can do this. And she could have maybe beat the price by 10% or something. But even if she didn't do that, she was the person I'd been working with. But she didn't do that. And part of the reason she didn't do that is that this company, the owner of the company, luckily was married to a lawyer and so knew that you needed to have these agreements. So she had these kinds of agreements in place that said, you're not going to take my confidential information. You're not going to do those kinds of things. And so it precluded this contractor from trying to hire me. So that's kind of the power of this. And if you think about it in your life, you've probably had situations where contractors left the company they were with and then tried to solicit you. I know, my wife has a cleaning service we use, It is a woman who previously worked for this company, who then she left that company and she came and, again, she was a woman who had been doing, cleaning our house for a certain period of time. And so my wife went with her. I have no idea whether she had a confidentiality agreement or not, but we know those kinds of things happen all the time. You want to have those agreements in place so you can prevent it from happening, or at least have the option to. So employees and independent contractors, you've got to have this information in place. Now, the next category where this might come up, I'm going to broadly categorize as joint venturers. But broadly speaking, this is where you are going to be working potentially with another entrepreneur or contractor to meet a joint goal. They're not really a worker for you. You're independent, but you're going to work together. Maybe it's an affiliate relationship. Maybe you're considering creating a joint course. Maybe it's a manufacturer who's making a product for you. You can imagine all of these different places where it would come in. Maybe it's, you've created a product and they're going to create a kind of a white labeled version of it under a license. You can see how it could come up. And in those contexts, you're often going to need to share confidential information with each other in the first place to assess whether you want to do business together. So, for example, you would need to see information about a potential joint venture. For example, see their list or do things like that so you have a sense of whether they're a good partner. And if you want someone to market your product, you will probably have to give them access to it and kind of access to the behind the scenes so they see how that works. So in that context as well, you're going to want a confidentiality agreement in place so that regardless of what happens, if you do business together, great, you can share information with each other, knowing that the other one can't use that information after the joint venture is over. But more importantly, you need to use that non-disclosure agreement or some other kind of confidentiality agreement before you do the deal when you're investigating it to make sure that any information you share with the other side to help them decide whether to do business with you is protected. Because the last thing you want is to go into one of these negotiations, give them all this information, and then they're like, okay, good. I don't want to do business with you. I'm going to just do it myself. And then they take all the information you gave them access to and use that to create, say, a competing service, a competing product, or whatever. So that's what you need to make sure you're careful about with joint ventures. So again, use confidentiality agreements there. Now, the last place is a place that I'm going to be honest with you, it's a bit harder to deal with this, and it's an area that a lot of people don't think about. But this is course participants and clients. You need to think through whether you're sharing confidential or proprietary information, methods, etc., with people who take one of your online programs or online courses, or who maybe is a one-on-one client. So again, let's go back to the podcast host issue, for example. Let's say that this company decided they wanted to share access to their database with their clients and, they had a monthly payment plan. Well, the last thing they want is for their clients to come on, download the entire list, and then use that as a guide, and then stop doing business with them. So in that context, you can kind of see how there is some of this confidential information, and you need to have these agreements as part of your overall client agreement or online program or online course agreement. And again, it's going to be pretty standard language. It's going to say that you cannot use the confidential information you learn here for any purpose other than X, Y, and Z. In an online course, it can be a bit trickier, right? I mean, you have to figure out what are you exactly limiting, but you might want to say, hey, I'm going to teach you how to do this, and we're going to be doing it on an ongoing basis, but you can't then use this and sell this as a service to someone else. You can't do that. You can only use it for your own business. Again, I'm going to be candid with you. In that context, it's going to be much harder to enforce because how do you figure out if they've done it? How do you, enforce it? They're harder things, but you want to have these agreements in place so that you can make the decision. Because if you don't have the agreements in place, you can't do anything about it. You have no options. And so that's what you're going to want to do there with your course participants. And more particularly with your clients, if you're going to give your clients any access to your confidential information. So that's it in a nutshell. Trade secret law is all about protecting your confidential information and making sure that people who rightly have access to it can't use it to compete with you, to hurt you, etc. It limits what they can do with it, and then it's also going to have, restrict them and mean that they have to get rid of it once they quit doing business with you. So that's trade secret in a nutshell. The key here is take reasonable steps to protect it, and the big pieces here are you need to have written agreements with your independent contractors, with your employees, with anyone who you might do business with and you're going to share confidential information with, and then with course participants and clients, if they're going to get access to anything that's confidential or proprietary. If you do that, you will be protected. So that's the key, and that's how you protect your confidential information. And that's it for this week. Next week, we're going to be kind of wrapping up the area of law discussions with a discussion of the right to publicity, what's involved there, what you need to do, and how you need to think about that. And then we're going to be getting back to our regular programming with guests. And, I've got some really great guests set up, and you'll get some guests and then some quick legal lessons. So tune in next week for that final kind of legal mini training, and then you can expect we'll close out. I don't know if that'll be August or September by the time we get to it, but we'll be starting back to our regular program. That's it for now. Talk to you later.
Thanks for listening, and remember to visit mistakes.youronlinegenius.com to get your essential guide to the 4 legal mistakes that can doom your business and how to avoid them. Join us next week for another episode to expand your online genius and your success.